Wrestling fans, here is part 2 of the August 14, 1996 Wrestling Observer newsletter. Let's read. Perhaps the single most important concept Shinma and New Japan should be credited with is promoting junior heavyweight wrestlers on a major level in a top company. The junior heavyweight division had largely been dead in the United States after the mid-70s with the retirement of Danny Hodge, and in reality even Hodge was only a big deal in the McGurk, later Watts Mid-South, territory where his real sports legend was well known. Although there had been previous junior heavyweight champions in Japan, it was never a big deal on any kind of level. The concept may have been created as much out of necessity as anything else. Inoki had a young protege named Tatsumi Fujinami, who was a spectacular worker but too small at the time to be taken seriously by the standards of the day. At the same time, there was a lot of interest in Mexican wrestling because All Japan's Mil Mascaras had turned into an incredible drawing card with his unique moves and flashy ring costumes. Since most of the best wrestlers in Mexico were undersized by Japan standards, Shinma created both a WWF Junior Heavyweight Championship, for Fujinami, and a Light Heavyweight Championship, which actually never got over as big for Gran Hamada, and worked out a talent exchange deal with Francisco Flores, who headed the UWA, at the time the most successful promotion in the Mexico City area. The Junior Heavyweight title made Fujinami a star, and made stars out of his challengers like Chavo Guerrero Connect, El Solitario, most importantly, Dynamite Kid, and a young man from Calgary named Bret Hart. Eventually Fujinami became big enough to be considered a top heavyweight, but his move may have been prompted more by one of Shinma's greatest creations of all, Tiger Mask. Satoru Sayama was a super athlete in the New Japan camp, the greatest flyer ever in camp, who was also particularly adept at kickboxing, and he was a terrific shooter for his size as well. But he was only 5'5" and 160 pounds, far too small to be a pro wrestler in those days. He was sent away to both Mexico and England, where, to say he was a sensation would be the understatement of all time. Sayama, who wrestled for less than 2 years total in Mexico, is generally considered high on any list of the all-time greatest wrestlers ever in that country, and every Japanese wrestler who comes to the country is immediately and unfavorably compared with him. In England, under the name Sammy Lee, billed as a cousin of Bruce Lee, he became a phenom as well with his feud with Mark Rollerball Rocco. Tiger Mask was originally a popular television cartoon in Japan, with a pro wrestling theme. Tiger Mask was an orphan who learned to wrestle, who had a twin brother that he didn't even know he was related to, who became his biggest rival, the hated Black Tiger, a role played in the Tiger Mask wrestling days by Rocco. And he had a big friend called the Giant Zebra. Ironically, the Giant Zebra in the cartoon was supposed to be a secret animated version of Giant Baba. Shinma, in order to appeal to young children who were largely in the All Japan camp due to the popularity of Mascaras and Terry Funk, since the teenage and young adult audience were Inoki's core crowd due to the martial arts matches, wanted to create a real-life version of Tiger Mask and make him a small, speedy wrestler so young children could empathize with him. The choice came down to Sayama or Hamada, both of whom were exceptional but smaller wrestlers. In April of 1981, Sayama debuted under the mask against Dynamite Kid, who would go on to be his legendary rival. While kids immediately took to the character, the hardcore audience didn't like the gimmick. The costume was too cartoonish for the hardcore Japanese audience used to black boots and black tights. Plus he was too small. But after dispatching of one wrestler after another from Mexico using a style never seen before in Japan, eventually the hardcore audience had to admit Sayama was something special. Fujinami moved up to the heavyweight division, and on January 1, 1982, Sayama defeated Kid to become WWF Junior Heavyweight Champion. He later defeated Leigh Thornton to become NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion, and for the most part held both titles until August of 1983, when he announced his retirement. Shortly after that retirement ended the period where everything New Japan had turned to gold. After the Iway feud came perhaps the biggest and among the most important angle in the history of the Japanese business. Riki Choshu, who was basically number 4 on the pecking order behind Inoki, Fujinami, and Sakaguchi, did a fake shoot angle where he was frustrated and turned on Fujinami. Choshu formed a group called Ishingun. The current Heisei Ishingun group is a modern-day copy of that angle, a supposed promotion within a promotion to feud with the established New Japan stars, called Sekigun. The combination of foreign stars like Hogan, Andre and Butcher, the Ishingun vs. Sekigun Japanese feud, and Tiger Mask and rivals like Dynamite Kid, Black Tiger, Mark Rocco, Steve Wright, Amada, Bret Hart and Kunyaki Kobayashi in the middle spelled the greatest run of box office success perhaps in the modern history of wrestling. New Japan sold out 90% of its dates over a 1-year period. Its television show aired in primetime on Saturday nights and drew between a 20 and 25 rating every week, making it usually among the top 5 television shows in the country. It set the stage for the monthly magazines to go weekly and placed Japan as the worldwide hotbed and revolutionary force in pro wrestling. Up to that point, with the exception of the rare interpromotional match like Inoki's earlier matches with Kimura and Strong Kobayashi, the top drawing matches in Japan and virtually all the main events involved Japanese versus foreigner. The bigger name the foreigner, the more money the feud would draw, which enabled a few foreigners with huge names or karate stars willing to help in the creation of Inoki's illusion to make the biggest payoffs anywhere in the world at the time while wrestling in Japan. However, Choshu's charisma on top changed the equation forevermore, and was the beginning of what is today's Japanese wrestling world. And then, as quick as it all came, it was over. While Inoki and Shinma had created one of the great business booms ever, suddenly it was no longer the Inoki one-man show but an entire card of super over monster draws. With their singles feud over the WWF International Heavyweight title, Fujinami and Choshu suddenly became stars of almost the same magnitude of Inoki. Perhaps nobody would have figured it out for many years either, except another of those funny things happened on June 2, 1983. For more than 2 years, Inoki had created a phony worldwide IWGP heavyweight tournament with announcing standings and results involving some of the biggest names in the world until the finals were scheduled in May of 1983. It turned out to be one of the biggest tournaments in history, and came down to Inoki and Hogan. While Inoki was on the ring apron in one of the most famous spots in Japanese wrestling history, Hogan ran across the ring and gave him a lariat, which at the time was his finishing move in Japan since they never would accept the leg drop as a finishing move. Inoki hit his head on the floor, panic ensued, Inoki swallowed his tongue, was totally unconscious. Inoki couldn't continue get up, was thrown back in the ring by the wrestlers around the ring, I guess hoping for a miracle in that Hogan would find a way to pin himself, but Inoki didn't move and after a lot of confusion, the match was stopped. Hogan's first pro wrestling world title was not the one part of a well-thought-out marketing plan, and Hogan had the title Inoki had spent years building up for himself to win. Inoki was hurt so badly from the fall that he was out of action for 3 months, and it was years before he fully recovered his stamina. He was really never the same physically on a consistent basis, although he did have a few memorable matches over the years, including one as late as January 4, 1996 against Vader. Everyone figured business would drop without the big star on the shows. But Choshu and Tiger Mask and Fujinami were so hot that the company continued to sell out every night. Suddenly the other headline wrestlers realized they should be all earning a lot more money when they were on top with all the sellout houses. Exactly what happened behind the scenes at this point isn't well documented, but the end results once again changed the face of wrestling history. With Shinma running the business, he and Inoki had used company money to save Inoki's side businesses that weren't as successful. The money from all the sellout houses disappeared to save Inoki's outside interests as fast as it came, and then some. The wrestlers, furious about the embezzlement of funds, attempted a coup, similar to what Baba and Inoki tried more than a decade earlier. When the coup failed, it was Sayama who was in the Inoki position, in that he was the one about to take some major heat. Rather than face the repercussions, he suddenly retired, but the details of Inoki and Shinma's being caught embezzling millions from the company went public. Inoki had to give up his presidency of the company, and Shinma, the booker and chairman of the board, who was the mastermind behind creating what at the time was the biggest wrestling promotion probably in history, basically the creator of the Inoki Illusion, Tiger Mask Explosion and the Choshu Revolution, was the big scapegoat, having to resign completely. Inoki returned as a wrestler, but by this point feelings had embittered toward him. The company proved it could draw without him. Physically he was past his prime, yet he continued to be on top and would never put over the upcoming stars. Choshu and Fujinami's feud was still on fire even after a multitude of double countout finishes on major shows. When the public first heard word about the embezzlement scandal involving the wrestling hero, business dropped, similar to a post-strike atmosphere in baseball, at least after the early strikes. And like with baseball, a few months later, fans forgot and business was strong. But the bitterness remained. First Shinma, mad because he was the scapegoat and with plenty of ideas left, created his own promotion, the Universal Wrestling Federation, and went about his new job of creating his second Inoki, a 24-year-old former karate star named Akira Maeda. Shinma initially got the backing from the WWF and sent Maeda there to win the international title that Fujinami and Choshu had feuded over. But that deal fell apart while Maeda was on tour, and suddenly Maeda, sent to the WWF as a star, was forced to do jobs every night. Maeda brought his trainer Yoshiaki Fujiwara and his little brothers in New Japan with him to UWF, Nobuhiko Takada, the young wrestler with perhaps the most potential of all, and Kazuo Yamazaki, the longtime training partner of Sayama. Shinma also convinced veterans including Rusher Kimura to join with his group and even made a play for Inoki to leave New Japan, although Inoki apparently agreed at one point and then backed out. Karl Gotch was then hired as trainer, and Gotch tried to convince the wrestlers to change the style to something more serious and realistic. The UWF became the first pure shoot illusion in that it was simply just a stiffer work but paved the way to a whole new trend in Japanese wrestling, a 9-year-long journey from fake shoots popular only among hardcores in Tokyo, to a brief period as the most successful promotion in the world, all the way to the end products, today's UFC, Vale Tudo, which Sayama is now a promoter of, Pancrase and K1 Kickboxing. Ironically, Shinmo was booted out of the group he created before long. With the company's new direction not exactly setting the world on fire, some of the wrestlers went to Sayama, the retired superstar who, while a great flyer and lucha stylist, still in his heart always preferred a more realistic style from his kickboxing and shooting background. Sayama, who had written a wrestling expose called Kayfabe during his period out talking about the scandal and the fact wrestling matches were predetermined, agreed to come back for a huge payoff. Having Sayama work greatly boosted the group's credibility and they became a hot cult ticket in Tokyo, although still had trouble drawing elsewhere. Sayama made A goes or I go ultimatum regarding Shinma, as the bitter feelings remained from the New Japan period, and the wrestlers backed Sayama. However, Sayama and Maeda ended up with an ego clash of their own 1 year later while the company was falling apart in the middle of its own gangster scandal. In September of 1985, about 18 months after its debut, the first UWF ran its final wrestling show and Sayama retired for the second time. There was even more bad news on the horizon. A second IWGP Heavyweight title tournament was held in 1984, with Inoki set to win the title he had built up for himself, and gaining revenge for his loss to Hogan. However, by this time, Hogan was WWF champion and on the verge of becoming the biggest mat star on the planet. Hogan didn't want to do a clean job, no doubt, nor did his promoter, Vince McMahon Jr., want him to, but Inoki definitely had to go over this time. A compromise finish was worked out where they would twice do double countouts and have the match restarted, and at the finish, Choshu would come out and give both Hogan and Inoki lariats outside the ring. Inoki would crawl in before the count and win the match via countout. That compromise was the worst thing possible for business, not that it would be the last time Hogan would be involved in a finish described afterwards as that. Fans were so fed up with the finish that they rioted, destroying the hallowed building and were setting fires. The rioting lasted for something like 20 minutes, and when the dust cleared, New Japan was banned from its big show arena for 1 year, killing its chances of doing Monster Gates. TV Asahi was getting a really bad taste in its mouth about the people who ran the company and the fans who attended the matches. That was hardly the biggest blow to New Japan. In late 1984, Naoki Otsuka, New Japan's leading house show promoter, had a falling out with the hierarchy as well and initially wanted to create his own company using Choshu as the top draw. While that never got started, Otsuka worked together with Baba behind the scenes and Choshu, Masa Saito, Animal Hamaguchi, Yoshiaki Yatsu, Kobayashi, Super Strong Machine, Hiro Saito, Dynamite Kid, Davey Boy Smith and a half dozen others left New Japan for All Japan, changing the balance of power completely. With Inoki's rep in shambles, and almost all its biggest stars walking out, TV Asahi, which kept the company afloat after the embezzlement scandal, had seen just about enough. It literally came down to Fujinami, who both All Japan and UWF recording, as to the survival of the company. Fujinami stayed. The network kept the company going, and in 1985, Inoki got a measure of retribution by stealing one of Baba's biggest stars, Bruiser Brody. The Inoki-Brody feud picked business up from its low levels. All Japan had taken advantage of Inoki's weaknesses and rebounded with fresh matches to become the dominant force in Japanese wrestling. The signing of Brody to what at the time was the biggest money per week deal probably in the history of wrestling up to that point drew strong enough television ratings, usually between a 15 and a 20, sometimes higher for the Inoki-Brody singles bouts, that the danger of the network folding the company had ceased. The biggest match in the history of junior heavyweight wrestling, at least on the surface, took place on August 5. Both Ultimo Dragon and Great Sasuke came out with 4 models apiece, each holding a title belt over their heads. The two themselves were an amazing story. Yoshihiro Asai was part of the New Japan dojo, but couldn't make the grade, largely because of his size. But he wanted to be a wrestler so bad that, similar to Keiichi Yamada a few years earlier, he flew to Mexico and in a foreign country knowing nothing except that it was the land of mil mascaras, turned himself into a great wrestler and returned to Japan, and made a big hit. Masanori Murakawa, who came from a more upper-class background, would literally follow wrestling tours around the country as a teenager. He turned pro with a couple of his friends as an undercard green wrestler in the lucha-style promotion run by Shinma's son where Asai had become the top draw. Murakawa first went under the name Masa Michinoku, which means Masa on the way. Current wrestler Taka Michinoku is not his brother, but a kid who grew up wanting to be the next Takada on the way. Asai became Murakawa's teacher and as often happens, within a few years, the student surpassed the teacher. Doing daredevil moves that were beyond anything seen to that point in Japan, the great Sasuke started to develop a following. Murakawa started his own lucha promotion in Japan, doing the bookkeeping himself in the morning, and became the Japanese version of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, going into tiny villages at the local high school or rec center running shows in which they ran on such a tight budget that they didn't even bring chairs. The fans would sit on the floor and watch the matches from close range. Now that they're more successful, sitting on the floor and watching Michinoku Pro has become a cult thing in the northeastern section of Japan. Nobody that goes to the shows wants to sit in chairs. It was the biggest match of their careers, but like everything else in wrestling, things don't always end up as they seem. 1. Otani beat Nagata in 12:56 with an Achilles tendon submission. After Otani's great performance the previous night, he did a totally different match this time, total Ufi style on the mat, exchanging holds with some suplexes at the end. A great opener. 3.5 stars. 2. Goto pinned Hiro Saito in 10:42 after 2 back suplexes. The first half of the match was terrible, mainly brawling with no heat. Saito picked things up and carried Goto to a really good and very heated last few minutes, doing senton after senton on him for near falls. 2 stars. 3. Kobayashi and Nagami beat Liger and Samurai in 14:24. Liger did a lot of comedy early. Eventually the heel stuff pile drove him on the floor. Kobayashi did a superplex on Samurai and Nagami followed with a splash off the top, the old power and glory finisher, for a near fall. Samurai also kicked out of a stuffed power bomb and Kobayashi's trademark fisherman suplex. Finally Liger mad the hot tag and eventually gave Kobayashi a plancha. In the ring, Samurai got a near fall with a German suplex on Nagami. When he tried a second, Nagami reversed it and used a rolling German suplex, a series of 2 in a row rolling and holding on to the first once, to score the pin. 3.25 stars. 4. Fujinami beat Nishimura in 7:32 with an abdominal stretch, one of Inoki's 70s finishers that was called in those days the Grand Cobra Twist. Another dead match with Fujinami using a total 70s style, including doing 2 Billy Robinson backbreakers to set up the abdominal stretch. 1/4 star. 5. Hashimoto and Kojima beat Akitoshi Saito and Ohara in 13:48. This match was incredible. Hashimoto limped to the ring and the New Japan doctor got in his way and tried to tell him not to work. Hashimoto shoved him aside but then while in the ring, apologized to him. The doctor stayed at ringside during the match and kept teasing he was on the verge of stopping it. Kojima reminds me of the Nasty Boys with similar charisma but a lot more talent. Ohara and Kojima slapped the hell out of each other. Hashimoto tagged in and they went right for the right knee. The match had tremendous heat and was worked more of a US faces versus heel style with Ohara and Saito continually working the knee. Finally Hashimoto hit a DDT on Ohara and tagged out. Kojima was doubled on but kicked out of a powerbomb. After a few more near falls on Kojima, with his back turned, Hashimoto slapped Kojima's back without him knowing it to tag in. They continued working the knee with Hashimoto making explosive comebacks. Finally Hashimoto went for his brainbuster, and at the top, teased the knee giving way as it had the night before. Finally the knee gave out again in the middle of the move, but Ohara was already up, so Ohara landed even harder on his head and was pinned. Ohara was carried from the ring while Hashimoto laid there immobile for several minutes before being helped back. An incredible performance by Hashimoto. 4 stars. 6. Sasuke captured all 8 belts, pinning Dragon in 13:56. The match had great atmosphere between all the belts and the teacher versus student storyline, with Yuji Yasuroka seconding Dragon and Tiger Masks hitting Sasuke. They started with fast moves like arm drags in the ring. Dragon used the Dragon Screw into a Texas Cloverleaf for a near submission. Later Dragon faked a dive, then backed off, and went for the tope. Dragon then hit the move he made famous, the Asai Moonsault. But all the years of doing moves like that have taken its toll and his right knee went out. In the ring he used a brainbuster and Liger bomb for near falls but was limping really bad. With both men standing on the top rope, Sasuke did a standing dropkick which sent Dragon to the floor. Sasuke hit his own Asai Moonsault and got up limping as well. In the ring, Sasuke missed a moonsault and Dragon used a tiger suplex for a near fall. Dragon went behind Sasuke while both were on the top rope to do a Rana off the top, but turned it into a Hurricane Rana for a near fall. He teased doing a power bomb off the apron, the move Das Cars did to Sasuke last year which, as ironies would have it, cracked Sasuke's skull. But Sasuke blocked it. Sasuke then did the crazy move of the match. He went to the top apparently for another rider kick, but instead balanced himself on the post and pushed off, flying way out in the aisle, and doing a full flip. Unfortunately, Dragon was even farther out and didn't catch him, and in the turning, landed with the back of his head cracking on the floor. It was serious enough that he groggily got into the ring and told the ref he was hitting the finish as quick as possible. Sasuke missed another moonsault. Dragon got a near fall with La Magistral. As Dragon went for a power bomb, it was turned into a Frankensteiner. Dragon didn't know it was the finish, but Sasuke and the ref did, and the ref counted 3 even though Dragon actually kicked out. The finish looked bad because of that. The finish was supposed to come 4 spots later, with Dragon using the running power bomb he used to beat Otani the previous night, and Sasuke turning that into a Frankensteiner the second time and getting the pin. The president of TV Asahi came into the ring to present Sasuke with an award. Somehow I don't think the president of NBC would do that after the main event at WrestleMania. Sasuke left amidst a celebration carrying 6 belts around his arms and wearing 2 around his waist. 4 1/4 stars. Inoki came out to a thunderous ovation every night just before intermission. Ovations the likes of which no other wrestler alive could get except in their wildest imagination. When he came out this time, he mentioned how spectacular a match it was and that it must have been, since when he was a wrestler, he only had 1 belt. 7. Chono 4 beat Yamazaki 2 in 12:25 in a B block match. It started fast and soon slowed. Then Chono got heat working on Yamazaki's fingers. Yamazaki got a choke right in the middle with apparently no escape. However, Chono broke it by going after the finger again. Chono finally got the STF in the middle, and at the same time bent the bad hand back in a wrist lock and Yamazaki submitted. 2 stars. 8. In a match to determine the A Block Championship and a slot in the finals, Choshu, 8, beat Sasaki, 4, in 15-13. Another teacher versus protege match with great heat. Very stiff but also simple when it came to moves. They traded headbutts and Sasaki kept using the power strangle for near submissions and Choshu having to go to the ropes. By the 3rd time, there was super heat. After Choshu broke the moves, Sasaki went for a pin but Choshu kicked out to a huge pop. Choshu then began hitting lariats, but on the 3rd one, Sasaki caught him in the Ipponze, but somehow while doing the move, Choshu caught him in a Hickson Gracie choke while on top. Sasaki was smothered underneath and you couldn't see him as Choshu had him buried. Referee was selling it like crazy, frantically trying to check Sasaki but being unable to see him tap or go out. After a long time with Choshu on top, the ref stopped the match. What hurt the finish was when Sasaki finally got up, he complained to Hattori that he had never submitted, and Choshu then hit him with a lariat and ordered Hattori to count to 3. The American-style post-match was flat and kind of killed Sasaki the next night. Apparently the original plan was for Sasaki to beat his teacher for the first time on this show, which would set up a playoff the next day after Sasaki beat Hashimoto, which Choshu would then win. 3 1/2 stars. 9. Muto 4 beat Koshinaka 4 in 11:59 in a B block match. Muto needed the win here or he'd be mathematically eliminated. The match actually started out a little weak since Koshinaka's knee went out doing a spot, so the spot looked bad and Muto had to put him in a wrist hold. When he was recovered, it made up for lost time with Muto doing all his signature spots, handspring elbow, facebuster, dropkick off the top, and finally went for a Frankensteiner off the top rope, but Koshinaka held on and Muto landed on his head. Koshinaka hit one big move after another for near falls which got big pops as Muto kept kicking out. Finally Muto hit the dragon screw and followed it with a dropkick off the top rope to the back. He put Koshinaka on the top as if he was going to Frankensteiner or superplex him, but instead used a dragon screw followed by a moonsault and went for the figure 4, but Koshinaka turned it into an inside cradle for a near fall. Koshinaka then one big move after another in rapid succession for near falls before Muto caught him with another dragon screw and got the figure 4 on in the middle. Probably the best finish of the entire week. 4 1/4 stars. The show itself was the best one of the tournament. But the post-match had a bad note. Sasuke had to be taken to the hospital. He cracked his head in 2 places, landing doing the flip dive while kicking off the ring post. He needed 5 stitches to close one of the cuts, but fractured his skull, apparently similar to his injury against Dos Caras. He was then allowed to leave the hospital in Tokyo the next morning but had to check into the hospital in his hometown of Aomori in northern Japan. In the tournament, Hashimoto, too, technically got a forfeit win over Hirata, but it really didn't matter since he was mathematically eliminated. Choshu was in the finals. In the B block, Koshinaka, Chono and Muto all had 2-1 records and 4 points. Koshinaka had a match with Kojima, which he figured to win, and Muto and Chono were to face each other. If there was a tie, there would be a playoff with the winner facing Choshu later that night. After the UWF folded, Maeda, Takada, Fujiwara and Yamazaki returned to New Japan in January of 1986, but it was a short but important trip. The wrestlers all had nowhere else to go. And New Japan needed them, since it was trying to remove the stench from a screwed-up tag team tournament which ended 1985. Inoki and Sakaguchi were scheduled to face Brody and Jimmy Snuka. A few days before the finals, Brody, who went to Japan in a bad mood to begin with, had a singles match with Sakaguchi, a huge former national judo champion, turn into a semi-shoot with Brody using his chain and attacking Sakaguchi's knee. Since Sakaguchi was the president of the company, Brody figured his days were numbered, and on the train as they were going to Tokyo for the championship match, Brody simply got off the train. Snuka, to show loyalty to Brody, got off with him. Trying to make the best of a horrible situation, a no-show in the tag tournament finals, Inoki and Sakaguchi wrestled Fujinami and Kengo Kimura in the impromptu finals, and for the first time, Inoki allowed his protege Fujinami to pin him. Maida's return was the next stage of the interpromotional angle, this time bigger than ever. There was more box office power in Inoki versus Maeda than any wrestling match in company history. Only one problem. Maeda absolutely refused to put Inoki over. At one point, booking without a finish in mind, or perhaps with the traditional double countout in mind, New Japan announced an Inoki versus Maeda match for Sumo Hall, and sold all 11,000 tickets in a few hours. However, they had to change it to a 10-man tag match main event with the UWF versus New Japan because Maeda wouldn't put Inoki over, or even work with him, and worse than that, there was legitimate fear what Maeda would do in the ring to Inoki. However, the Maeda submission-oriented style, while able to sell a lot of tickets for the right dream match, wasn't as successful to the casual fans who didn't understand the less flashy submission moves. While 1986 educated a lot of casual fans to submissions and paved the way for the future success of shoot-style pro wrestling that followed a few years later, TV ratings fell and New Japan eventually lost its Saturday night primetime slot. Maeda was a combination charismatic star and problem. He couldn't work well with Americans, but had great matches with Japanese. They had a goldmine match but couldn't put it on because neither would do a job or even make the other look good, or for fear, like in Maeda's famous match with Andre the Giant, it would turn into an uncooperative disaster. All these things built Maeda's reputation with the younger fans, and he was still expected to be the Inoki of the future. That was only made clearer when New Japan went back to the old formula, the mixed martial arts match, booking a double main event on October 9, 1986, Maeda against a former world light heavyweight kickboxing champion named Don Nakia Nielsen, Inoki against a former heavyweight boxing champion Leon Spinks. The show drew a sellout crowd, but more importantly, drew a 29 rating on television. Things couldn't have gone better for Maeda, as he and Nielsen put on the greatest mixed match, at least up until that time, in history, while Spinks was a total disaster as an opponent to put over Inoki. The clamor was greater than ever to build the company around Maeda. New Japan got another boost when the prodigal son, Choshu, returned in mid-1987 after leaving All Japan, while holding its PWF heavyweight title, bringing back most of the wrestlers he took with him. Suddenly New Japan had talent like in the glory days, but so much damage had been done over the previous 4 years that neither the crowds nor television ratings picked up like everyone thought Choshu's return would do. With Choshu and company back, Maeda was suddenly no longer the flavor of the month. Which leads to the shoot kick. The original UWF, idolized by the teenagers of that time as the real deal, was a hot ticket at Korakuen Hall in Tokyo, but really nowhere else. After the promotion folded and Maeda and Takada returned to New Japan, the New Japan Korakuen Hall shows were considered UWF home court. A 6-man tag was scheduled at Korakuen Hall in November of 1987 with Choshu's team against Maeda's, and rumors were flying several days beforehand that something was going to happen. As Choshu held Osamu Kido in a scorpion, leaving himself wide open, Maeda threw a legitimate kick as hard as he could to Choshu's eye. While it didn't knock Choshu down, it did bust his eye and break an orbital bone. New Japan was faced with one major predicament. What Maeda did was simply shoot a kick in a style that worked. Kicks were thrown regularly. To make a big deal about it publicly would be basically a public admittance wrestling was a work and let everyone know the kick was a shoot. To ignore it would be even worse for business, because anarchy could take over in a minefield of egos. Maeda was immediately suspended, and New Japan laid out a series of stipulations which he'd have to follow, such as spending several months in Mexico where he'd have to do lucha style and make little money, and when he returned, put Choshu over clean in a singles match. Maeda had not done a job for any Japanese wrestler except Fujiwara, who had a shooter reputation, since his return. As his punishment, Maeda refused and never wrestled for New Japan again. Yet his cowardly act ironically made him, along with Hulk Hogan, one of the 2 hottest wrestlers in the world. A very minor incident took place that same week. A hot-headed 18-year-old wrestler who was the star of the dojo, with such amazing potential that was already wowing fans in prelim matches, was also suspended, in this case for punching out a cab driver. His name was Masaharu Funaki. Business dropped in the tag tourney with Maeda suspended and Choshu injured, to the point that only 5,000 fans attended the finals of the 1987 tag tournament, while at the same time, All Japan was on fire as it brought back Brody, Butcher and Snuka for its tag tournament. At this time, Inoki went for a WWF angle instead of a New Japan angle. He got the man who ruled the nighttime airwaves in Japan, the Japanese equivalent to Johnny Carson in those days, to become manager for a new monster superstar by the name of Big Van Vader. Jim Hellwig was originally supposed to be the monster who was going to be pushed as the new generation Stan Hansen or Hulk Hogan. Hellwig, however, went with the WWF, leaving New Japan with the second choice, Leon White. White's debut beating Inoki in 2 minutes at Sumo Hall was disastrous since the place was sold out based on an Inoki vs. Choshu main event. With fans mad after an angle that saw Inoki want to face the debuting monster instead of Choshu, they ended up first having Inoki beat Choshu in a quick 6-minute match, followed by Inoki losing in almost a squash to an unknown in order to make his rep immediately. At the time, Vader was a large green wrestler and his beating Inoki caused the place to riot. The talk show host immediately bailed out of the angle. Ironically, over the next year, while feuding with Fujinami, Vader became the most improved wrestler in the game and after that disastrous debut, turned into exactly what New Japan was hoping for, the next generation version of Stan Hansen. Rather than return to New Japan, Maeda got financing to form the second version of the UWF, with Takada, Yamazaki, Fujiwara and some time later, Funaki and Minoru Suzuki following suit. The UWF, with its more realistic style, sold out every card but one during 1988 and 1989, most in a matter of hours. All Japan and New Japan had made a habit of double count-out finishes when big stars were matched against each other, while UWF ended every match with a submission or knockout. Fans at the All Japan and New Japan shows started reacting very negatively when the finishes weren't clean, and the promotions had no choice but to change decade-long booking patterns created basically to protect the stars. This was also the beginning of the end of Inoki as a full-time wrestler. After Inoki broke his foot, Fujinami beat Big Van Vader to finally escape the shadow of Inoki and win his first World Heavyweight title. After carrying Inoki to his first classic match in years, a 60-minute draw where Fujinami retained the title, Fujinami, in the number 2 slot for so long, pulled his own power play, threatening to leave the company unless he was treated as the number 1 star. It worked for a short time as Fujinami headlined, while Inoki sat out and crowds dwindled, so Inoki was asked back once again for his last run on top. With business slow, Inoki went back to his past. With communism crumbling in the Soviet Union, it was Inoki who was the first person to negotiate the deal to bring in Soviet amateur athletic stars into professional sports. The latest fake shoot, in that people believed these legitimate Soviets with no understanding or knowledge of pro wrestling wouldn't lay down and do jobs for wrestlers, led to the biggest crowd in the history of Japanese wrestling up to that point, 53,800 fans and a world record $2,781,000 house at the Tokyo Dome on April 24, 1989 to see Inoki. Knowing it was time to change the formula, putting over Soviet judo champion Shota Takayashvili via a 5th-round knockout finish, thus finally losing his first mixed match and his world martial arts title. Since that time, New Japan has promoted annual shows at the Dome, with it selling out the building quickly for the second show, February 10, 1990, drawing nearly twice as many fans as Mike Tyson vs. Buster Douglas did in the same building the night before for an interpromotional match as New Japan's Choshu and George Takano faced All Japan's Genichiro Tenryu and Tiger Mask, Mitsuharu Misawa, and selling out most of the others since. By 1995, New Japan ran 3 Dome shows, 2 in Tokyo, 1 in Fukuoka, and drew more than 300,000 fans over 2 days at Mayday Stadium in North Korea. It was on the first Tokyo Dome show that New Japan went back to its past once again, attempting to create a second Tiger Mask-type character in Keiichi Yamada, taking the Japanese comic book and television cartoon character of Jushin Liger. After Sayama retired, New Japan took George Takano and put him under the hood as the Cobra. Coming so soon after Sayama, even though Takano was a talented wrestler, he lacked charisma and couldn't stand up to the obvious comparisons and the gimmick fizzled, although not before Cobra had some memorable matches. After Cobra was scrapped, the junior heavyweight division revolved around a classic feud between Takada's UWF style and Koshinaka's traditional pro wrestling style. After Takada went back to UWF, Koshinaka's new rival became Hiroshi Hazi, who eventually dropped the title to Liger. Liger went on to become the best wrestler in the world for a time, and through his own booking and creation of a new generation of Dynamite Kids, Chris Benoit, Black Tigers, Eddie Guerrero and Bret Hart's, Dean Malenko, the junior heavyweight division flourished like never before. Finally, some 15 years after Tiger Mask lit up the stage in Japan, junior heavyweights like Shawn Michaels, Benoit, Rey Mysterio Jr., Guerrero and the like appear to be leading the future path of American wrestling. Inoki's grip on the top was loosening, so he saved face and announced in 1989 he was retiring from wrestling full-time to run for the Japanese Senate. He actually won the election, in a typical Inoki finish, winning in a close call as the final ballots were being counted. Ironically, Inoki in infrequent doses is now far more popular and much more of a drawing card and legend today than he was during his mythical heyday against the martial artist and Tiger Jeet Singh. After Choshu, Fujinami and Vader traded the world title back and forth, it was time for today's New Japan to take over, the one-time Three Musketeers of Muto, Chono, and Hashimoto. And a few years later, they'll pave the way for the likes of Tenzan, Kojima, Otani, and Nagata. During this period, Choshu, who nearly killed the company with his jump, along with allies Hazi and Masa Saito pretty much took over the political power within the company and drove it to its current heights. Fujinami, ironically the man who saved the company back in 1984 when it was at death's door and the only star who remained loyal to the company during the bad times, ended up out of the political power in the #1 spot that he spent most of his life waiting patiently for Inoki to vacate. Things were at a fever pitch for what everyone figured to be Choshu's last hurrah on August 6. Like Connors in his last US Open, he had long since come full circle from the rebellious bad guy with so much charisma that he changed decade-long booking patterns, to the veteran whose days as a headliner seemed over but for this 1 week, he was attempting to relive his glory days. The plan worked, which is the beauty of pro wrestling, in that unlike real sports and the Jimmy Connors story, stories like this can be written for maximum drama and emotion and with the right finish. And this was Choshu himself writing the beginning of his final story as a wrestler. The asking price on the street for tickets was $100 if you were lucky, $200 if you weren't. After 2 straight days as the leading sports story, obviously an SRO crowd announced that 11,500 was going to be there. But although Choshu wrote and nearly executed his perfect story, reality again struck and Choshu wasn't the story. 1. Iizuka and Yasuda and Takaiwa beat Ohara and Nagami and Goto in 11:36. Reality set in early as Yasuda, the cult favorite, looked clumsy as ever in the early going, killing all the crowd heat. The guys chopped the hell out of each other to where everyone's chest was covered with bruises. It never got going, although the final few minutes of near falls got great crowd heat. Yasuda pinned Nagami with a pathetic splash off the top rope, in that Yasuda's feet landed on the mat well before his body landed on Nagami. 1 1/4 stars. 2. Nagata and Nishimura upset Hiro Saito and Tenzan in 11:32. This wasn't good either, even with Nagata involved. Nishimura was dead, and Saito left his working shoes in the match with Goto. The crowd popped big for the finish, as Saito missed a senton off the top rope and Nagata came back with a Kopo kick and an inside cradle. 1 1/2 star. 3. Kojima 2 upset Koshinaka 4 to eliminate him from the B block in 10:33. It started out hot with stiff clotheslines back and forth and lots of no-sell spots. Koshinaka did a great job carrying the match, since Kojima really doesn't have much of a repertoire outside of a great clothesline and a sloppy moonsault, but he's got an amazing amount of charisma live for someone so relatively young. The match ended up with near falls going back and forth and great heat. Koshinaka got near falls with all his signature moves. After a butt bump off the top, Koshinaka went for a power bomb, but Kojima blocked it. Kojima delivered a power bomb of his own for a near fall, but missed a moonsault. Koshinaka then wrapped Kojima up in an inside cradle, but Kojima reversed it and scored the pin, the biggest victory thus far in his career. The place went nuts for this finish, and afterwards Kojima climbed the ropes, and basically did a Nestia plunge backwards into the ring, almost as if he fainted in disbelief of scoring such a big win. 3 3/4 stars. 4. Sasaki 6 pinned Hashimoto 2 in 9:13. After all the drama Hashimoto provided in previous nights, this match didn't cut it. With both eliminated mathematically, fans were really waiting for Muto versus Chono. Sasaki's reaction was dead coming out stemming from the Americanized finish to his match with Choshu. And while Hashimoto got an awesome reaction, the tag match the night before played out the knee injury storyline to perfection. And to the crowd, it was like they blew their load in regard to Hashimoto the night before and weren't going to get up for the same thing so quickly. Sasaki opened with a dropkick to the knee and the scorpion. He continued to work on the knee throughout. Hashimoto made brief comebacks but mainly Sasaki dominated, and didn't look that good in doing so. The doctor came out again and teased stopping the match. Sasaki worked over the knee with the prison deathlock. They got up and heated up the crowd by spitting in each other's face and trading ultra-stiff blows. However, Hashimoto's mobility was gone and Sasaki hit him with a lariat and followed with an Ipponze for the pin. It was a week of a crowd popping for upsets of this type, but this didn't quite cut it. 1 3/4 stars. 5. Chono 6, beat Muto 4, in 24-43 to win the B block and earn the match with Choshu. They did a fast open teasing their big moves, but then it went to the mat for a long time, and even with all the crowd interest, it actually got boring. They picked things up and it was the typical Muto versus Chono excellent match with the same spots from years past. Muto hit the handspring elbow and facebuster, but then messed up a Frankensteiner off the top as Chono held onto the ropes. Muto then got up and went for a German suplex, but Chono low-blowed him and Chono used Muto's own figure 4 on him. After a rope break, the two traded Yakuza kicks and drop kicks back and forth reminiscent of their 1992 G-1 tournament match. Chono got the STF a few times, including once on the floor after Muto missed a handspring elbow and hit the guard railing. Muto came back with a wind sprint clothesline, but Chono caught him with a kick to the face. Chono got back in the ring and Muto had to crawl in on his hands and knees. Muto hit a Frankensteiner for a near fall but missed a moonsault, and Chono put on the STF for a long time. The teasing of this submission before the rope break was probably the best job of the entire week, and that's saying a lot because that is one spot that was worked often to perfection. Finally, Muto hit the dragon screw, hit the moonsault and went for the figure 4, but right before he locked it, Chono caught him with a low blow and pinned him with an inside cradle. Fans were throwing their drink cartons like crazy in appreciation for the quality of this match. 4 stars. Inoki came out after this match to the same frenzied reaction he'd been getting doing the same thing in the same spot all week. This time he mentioned that 2 years ago he started his final countdown to retirement and joked that, "That's been an awful long countdown." He said he had a dream for his final opponent, but it was only a dream. Giant Baba. 6. Fujinami and Kido beat Kimura and Kobayashi in 12:37 when Fujinami gave Kobayashi 2 Billy Robinson backbreakers and made him submit to the abdominal stretch. Just awful. The fans were laughing about how bad it was, which is sad because Fujinami was once the best worker in the business and his character can't do comedy. Missed spots everywhere. 1 star. 7. Casas and Otani beat Liger and Samurai in 13-19. The crowd was actually kind of dead for this match early, even though Casas and Otani looked good carrying things. Casas, whose eye was bandaged up from a cut 2 days earlier, did a nice tope on Liger. Things picked up from there, although Otani hurt himself during the match as he appeared to be dropped on his shoulder more than his back in receiving a stuffed powerbomb and was holding his neck the rest of the match and bleeding from the mouth. Casas pinned Samurai with law magistral. 3 1/4 stars. Liger then was given the house mic. There was a story in the newspaper that morning vaguely saying that Liger may not wrestle for the rest of the year. Liger quickly went over his situation, saying that doctors had discovered a tumor in his brain. He would be undergoing a biopsy to see if it was malignant later in the week, and would have an operation later in the month, August 23rd to be exact, to have it removed. If it's benign, he expected to return to the ring. If it's malignant, his career could very well be over, and asked the crowd to pray for him. His music played and he received a thunderous send-off, as fans realized it could be for the last time as an active wrestler. 8. Choshu pinned Chono in 13:45 to win the G1 tournament. Choshu was fired up, coming off the blocks with 3 Saito suplexes for near falls. Chono then went after Choshu's bad knee. After too many no-sell spots by Choshu to the point he was killing big moves, Chono got the match story going with an STF on the floor. After Chono broke the hold and got in the ring, Choshu laid almost motionless as if he'd passed out from the pain. Fujinami, his most famous rival, who was at ringside cheering him on, slapped Choshu in the face several times to awaken him. Chono got him in a half crab in the ring and there was a huge pop when Choshu made the ropes. Chono spit on Fujinami and pile-drove Choshu twice, but Choshu kicked out. He went back to the STF, but Choshu got to the ropes again. Choshu made a comeback with 2 lariats and a scorpion, but Chono made the ropes. After another lariat, Choshu put the scorpion on in the middle and got the submission. A basic, simple psychology match with great heat. It was a good match, but after everything that had taken place during the week, the climax of Choshu's 1-week story ended up being anticlimactic. 3 1/4 stars. New Japan had announced a press conference in Tokyo at 3 p.m. on August 7th. Choshu said that his left knee was bad and was hurting him the entire week. He said he would be retiring in 1997, although he's announced his retirement before, with his final match being in one of New Japan's scheduled 3 Dome shows next year. Choshu's final storyline hasn't been completely played out. He's counting on the emotion of his final stand to have a little more shelf life, In particular, his final shot at the world title in a final tag team program with Fujinami getting another day in the sun as his partner. While not yet announced publicly, it is believed Hashimoto defending the title against Choshu will headline October 6 card at the Tokyo Dome, a building the size of which New Japan never dared to attempt during his and the company's glory days of 1982. Liger, 31, told the press he had a tumor 2 centimeters in diameter in his brain. He said he would be going back to his hometown in Fukuoka and enter the hospital on August 21 for a laser operation 2 days later. He said he had been suffering major headaches since June, to the point at one point during that tour he went to the hospital to find out what was wrong. Before this tour, the doctors found the tumor. He said he fully expected to return to the ring. While Inoki was in the Senate, he and Shinma got back together and continued creating their illusions. Shinma ran Inoki's senatorial office and the two continued their angles, such as Inoki making a political version of a grandstand play with the government of Iraq, which as it turned out, perfectly coincided with the hostages being released. At one point, Inoki's ego got the better of him and announced he was running for mayor of Tokyo. When it became obvious he couldn't possibly win, he looked to finally get trapped in a situation with egg on his face. However, a political poll came out among males under 30 in Tokyo, who grew up watching Inoki on prime-time television, and, believe it or not, within that one demographic group, Inoki had the most support of all the mayoral candidates. The next day, Inoki dropped out of the race. Being mayor of Tokyo was nice and all, but he had more important things to do, such as working for peace and harmony in the world. But everything while in the Senate didn't run smoothly. Shinma claimed he was finally fed up with creating the illusions and storylines and apparently, of Inoki not living in reality. He got Inoki's secretary to come forward with stories of numerous political improprieties and tax evasion. Shinma himself came forward as well with more damaging charges. It was a huge news story for a few weeks and there was plenty of support for Inoki being impeached from the Senate and being indicted on serious charges. Of course, Inoki denied all, and no indictments ever resulted. But the story spelled the difference in Inoki receiving a crushing defeat in 1995 when he ran for re-election. New Japan continued the same training program that has created more Hall of Fame caliber wrestlers over the past 2 decades than all others combined. Inoki, much as he would have liked to, had his chance with Ali to do something athletically real 2 decades ago but couldn't pull it off. His hated rival and other prodigal son Maeda wanted to do the same thing but was also held back by the fact he too was just a pro wrestler, although he's taken wrestling one step closer to reality. Some 17 years after the Ali fiasco, mixed martial arts matches have become something of a rage. And the final generation right out of New Japan's camp, Funaki, has actually become the sports reality that Inoki's fantasy and Maeda's dream were of becoming. But Funaki's comparative success today as compared with Inoki and Maeda in their heyday has also been proof that fantasy is often far more powerful than reality. The single greatest angle in the history of wrestling took place in September of 1995, the New Japan vs. Ufi feud, which led to the Muto vs. Takada match. By this time, the man who specialized in the concept, Inoki, had almost nothing to do with New Japan's business and is basically a figurehead brought before the fans on big shows. It's the Choshu show, and his biggest angle resulted in an unprecedented 3 Tokyo Dome sellouts over a 7-month period, and more than $20 million in live revenue, gates plus concessions, over the 3 shows, including the biggest money live show of all time. It was the same old trick. Create a promotion versus promotion feud and put together a match that fans believe because the stakes are so unbelievably high, that fans believe nobody will do the job and they actually believe they're going to see something real. Whether it was Inoki versus Kobayashi, Inoki versus Ruska, Inoki versus Kimura, Inoki versus Chakaashivili, with the elusive Inoki versus Maeda or the biggest one ever, Muto versus Takada, the story is basically the same, the characters are just updated. We'll be doing a double issue next week to catch up everything in the United States. A few headlines. Ahmed Johnson is scheduled to undergo kidney surgery on August 12, so he's out indefinitely, and the match with Farouk Azad, Ron Simmons, at SummerSlam has been scrapped. Jeff Jarrett quit USWA and will sit out until starting with WCW in early October. Mr. Pogo suffered a serious neck injury on August 1 in Tokyo, taking a bump through broken glass and barbed wire onto pavement at an outdoor show in a match against Terry Funk. War has a show scheduled on October 11 in Osaka with Sasuke defending all 8 belts in a rematch against Dragon, and Mysterio Jr. defending his title against Psicosis. Current lineup for the September 22 pay-per-view from Philadelphia is Cornette and Vader vs. Michaels and Lothario, Owen and Bulldog vs. Sedan. Scheduled as Johnson, but that could change. Guns vs. Godwins for tag titles, which also may change. Vega vs. Azad, Mankind vs. Mero, and Undertaker vs. Goldust. At the Universal Valley Tudo Show on August 4 in Tokyo, Marco Ruiz beat Steve Jenham, UFC 3 champion, in 145 via knockout. Oleg Toktarov beat Joe Charles in 442 and Hugo Duarte knocked out Harold Howard, UFC 3 seconds place, in 29 and Richard Hurd, a wrestler, beat Fred Floyd to win an 8-man tournament. The WWF's lawsuit against WCW, TBS and Eric Bischoff is scheduled to go to trial in New Haven on August 19, but rumors have it that it won't get that far. Steve Williams debuted on ECW's August 3 show at the arena drawing 1,500 teaming with Tommy Dreamer to lose to Taz and Brian Lee when Lee pinned Dreamer. Sabu over Van Dam, Scorpio over Jericho in his last ECW match, and Gangstas winning a 4-team elimination over Bruise Brothers, Samoan Gangstas and Eliminators to take the tag belts also on show. ECW lost its New York time slot before the first show aired. Apparently CH31 took one look at the tape, which was bought as an infomercial rather than regular programming, and decided it would never air anything of that type. It's been said before and it'll be said again, the lifeblood of wrestling in this country is television. And if ECW persists on having all the blood, the angles where the women get beat up, and the swearing audible from the crowd chants and bleeping in interviews as a constant on the show, they aren't going to take anything but little baby steps when it comes to growth. A bikini contest with Sunny, Sable and Marlena will be on the free-for-all before SummerSlam. Pitbull number 1 Gary Wolf suffered a broken neck and will be out of action for quite some time. They are playing it up as a skull fracture, which it wasn't, and a career ender, which it isn't expected to be but is very serious. New Japan and WCW have a joint single elimination tournament from September 19 to September 23 in Japan, with first round being Chono vs Sting, Koshinaka vs Morris, Hashimoto vs Hall, Muto vs Regal, Choshu vs Norton, Tenzan vs Anderson, Luger vs Sasaki and Fujinami vs Flair. WWF drew 9,128 fans and $172,451 on August 2 in Montreal at the Molson Center with the typical tour results. In the special match, Raymond Raju beat Owen Hart in a boxing match when Hart's second, George Chuvalo, a former heavyweight contender who fought Muhammad Ali in the early 70s, got tired of Hart's attitude and KO'd him. WCW beat WWF on August 5 in the ratings, WCW doing 3.0 in both hours, averaging a 3.0 and 5.4 share to Raw's 2.8 and 4.6. However, the big story is that viewers were switching to Raw in droves during the show. Raw opened with a 2.2 and showed phenomenal growth, ending at 3.5. Nitro opened at 3.4 and lost its audience after what I was told was a horrible interview by Sting and Luger, who have a lot of heat on them because of it, ending with a 2.6. Other weekend ratings saw WCW Saturday Night at 2.3, Pro at 1.1, Action Zone at 1.8 and Mania at 1.5. 123 Kid set to debut for WCW this week. Dan Crawford and Doug Furnas were scheduled to start this month, but politics, they are all Japan wrestlers and New Japan is putting the screws to the deal, seem to have at least temporarily gotten in the way. Ron Race also scheduled to return from Japan. That didn't last long. Jacques Rougeau and Pierre Ouellet signed their WCW contracts on August 1, but they have no starting date scheduled. Horace Boulder, the nephew of Hulk Hogan, also signed a $125,000 per year deal, but again no imminent plans of him being used. It appears whatever problems there were with Cornette and Michaels have at least on the surface blown over. Pancrase pay-per-view taped September 7 with Suzuki vs Ken Shamrock and Rutan vs Funaki will air in the US on November 3, an experiment in moving to Sundays, the traditional wrestling pay-per-view night. Some talk of Yoji Anjo being the next EFC pay-per-view show in October,